Cans on. How's that sound in your ears? Is it,
Yeah, it's fine.
It's not too bad. Yeah, not too bad. I think. That thing doesn't come off me. Hello. Okay. That's good. I'll just snuggle up to you a little bit there, Terry. Okay.
So what direction you want to take? How do you want to...
We're on. We're on now. We're recording live, Terry.
Righto.
You nearly gave it all away. Well, the trick, Terry, is I don't tell my guests where we're going to take it. And I usually ask my guests if anything's out of bounds, but I didn't ask you that.
No, I don't.
You're not a sort of out of bounds kind of guy. Well, you're out of bounds kind of guy, but you're not like things are off the record.
Yeah.
Terry McCosker, if our listeners haven't already worked out, is seated beside me. For those on the machine on YouTube, you'll see him there. You get younger all the time. Every time I see you, Terry, you got some magic elixir thing going on.
Yeah, I reckon it's life.
Life.
Too right. It's worth living. There's so much to do.
Isn't there?
There's no time to get old or down or stupid. There's lots to do.
I like that. Life. And just quietly, we are in so welcome to the Regenerative journey, Terry, and welcome to the Brisbane City Botanic Gardens, a place I've been before. You've probably been here.
Yeah,
a
few times. Yeah.
A few times. There's actually a lot of people here. I don't know if actually Brisbane City Council could squeeze any more buggies into the park today.
No, there's around about 10, I think, of them, or 13. I did a tour here recently, and I think there's somewhere around 10 or 13.
And they actually said that.
Yeah, and I think there's about 20 odd gardeners.
Well, I think they're all here. They've got all the buggies out. I've seen probably, I reckon, half a dozen different ones, and mowers. That's not including the mowers.
What you might not know, Charlie, is that the gardens are run on regenerative lines.
Really?
Yeah. Yep. So
that's why I picked it here.
Yeah. Well, they don't use artificial fertilisers. They use compost. They're right up with some of the newer approaches to fertilisation. Their gardeners are right onto it.
Well, there was a fellow over here mulching tea tree there before, and probably wondering why I had a little generator parked behind a big palm tree over there. It's funny you say that, because there was a chappie here on a mower spraying the edges just in and around here 15 minutes ago. I don't know what with. Might have been geranium oil.
Yeah, I don't know what with either, but it's likely not to be.
Not, yeah. Well, I mean, certainly with people
ones.
walking around, that's been a bit rude.
Yeah.
Terry, let's get started. I mean, we are started, and I think it's wonderful that we finally, for listeners, I was just saying to Terry, we've stood each other up once each, so we're 1-1. I started this podcast in May 2020, so it's not quite 2 years old. And you've been at the top of my list for that shy of 2 years, Terry. And we finally, after I couldn't fly down to Burra there a few weeks ago, and you had a diary clash just Monday, just gone.
Yeah.
We finally organised ourselves to be here in the Botanic Gardens, and I have to say it was a bit of a rush and tear this morning. I had to get a horse to a vet about half an hour west of here this morning. So for viewers who can see that whatever that is on my front, that's from that. And we shuffled in here, parked illegally, and dragged all our gear down here. And I'm glad I made the effort. I was a bit nervous about timing, but it actually worked. It was perfect. So Terry, thank you for your time. I know you are a very busy man, and thankfully all the stars aligned this time. And
that's good.
We're here. We did have a quick chat at the Albury Land and Market conference last year, which was I was doing like 10 and 15 minute sessions with people before, and then you were the last. Actually, I stood you up that day. I remember that. I was going to meet you outside the conferencing.
So now it's 2-1.
Oh no. So the next time I try and catch up with you, I just know you're not going to turn And we had a lovely half an hour chat. It was supposed to be 10:15, and I couldn't shut you up, which was wonderful because it was kind of such a lovely way to finish the conference, and that became some little videos we put out there separately. Enough about me waffling on, Terry. So glad that we finally could catch up. I have to pump your tyres up just quickly up front. First time I saw you was at when I did Grazing for Profit in about 2005, and there was a video of you talking about grazing. It was pretty old. I think you had a dashing mustache on at the time. You might have been. It was pretty old reel.
It was actually about nutrition.
Oh, was it nutrition?
Yeah, I remember that.
Oh, gut flora.
Yes,
nutrition?
That's the one. Yeah.
So that's what. Yeah, it was rolled out. That's
had to stop using that. Yeah.
Are you still using it?
No. I look too young.
It's like people on LinkedIn or Facebook when you go, that's not them, and they use their
that's right.
10-year-old.
I still feel the same age, though, Charlie.
Well, I'm not a word of a lie. You look as young as well. You look a bit older than then, because that was probably 30 years ago. Terry, you've sort of already preempted my question about sitting here in the Botanic Gardens. I mean, what does it mean for you to be sitting here under it's a Java almond tree, I believe, because the sign says so. There's a sausage tree behind us. You know, there's activity. There's probably as fresher air as you can find in Brisbane right now. What does it mean to you to be sort of, and forget you're here with me, just the fact that you're in this space? What is it? Is that a good feeling?
It is a good feeling. It's got a really good feel about it. And to me, the exciting thing is just seeing the number of people wandering around and being part of it, and just slowly walking, talking, stopping, reading signs. Unfortunately, there's a heap of people going through at about 50 miles an hour on scooters and so on. But other than that, there's people enjoying it. And, you know, if you live in an urban space, how do you get to enjoy a little bit of nature and just sit down, listen to the birds, look at the ponds and see the ducks? And, you know, I just walked past a beautiful big frill-neck lizard, and it's I don't know how they've done it, but the energy here feels good.
Did you have something to do with that?
No, I didn't.
Well, I think I don't know if there's an Indigenous kind of footprint here or not. I'm not exactly sure. Kind of being on the river here, dare I say there might have been, because often people who dedicate areas like this to people kind of subconsciously or otherwise pick up on kind of previous usage and community, I suspect. Terry, I want it. Bloody choppers. I guess I should have expected that, shouldn't I? In the city. Terry, I'm going to jump to something that I know you're passionate about, biome. Breathing your biome.
Yeah.
Tell me about it. That's something that is a question I would ask later usually, but we're here and we're breathing biome. What does that actually mean?
I mean, just breathing in some of the biology that's occurring naturally, the biology created by the grass in front of us, the trees around us, the birds, the insects, all of that sort of stuff. And we evolved with that and part of it. And I think the more we learn these days about microbiomes, it's just unbelievable. You know, you start right with a seed, and the seed's got its own microbiome internally, its own microbiome externally, and then that plant germinates and it creates another whole microbiome in the root system, and then it creates another microbiome on the plant itself, and then it creates another one on the fruit or whatever that plant bears, and then we get to eat that, so we're actually eating that microbiome, and then we get to breathe it as well when we're in a good space. And I think if you, again, I couldn't consider living in a concrete jungle like this, because you'd just be breathing diesel fumes and petrol fumes and concrete fumes and listening to unnatural sounds. And I think, to me, one of the most really interesting things is bird sound first thing in the morning. and the role that bird sound plays in nature, in our lives, but particularly for plants. The plants wake up and respond to that bird sound.
Fair dinkum.
Yeah. And so I think there's also frequencies in those bird sounds which I think help set us up for the day. And if you're not exposed to that kind of stuff, I don't know how you set yourself up right for the day or the week or the month or the year.
That's interesting, because last night, just very quickly, I met with a group of other parents. Maybe I should have checked the flight schedule before. I was that a chopper or that mower? It's actually the mower.
Yeah,
Maybe
you got both.
No, we got both actually. A group of parents. We might actually. I'm wondering whether we even just take those headphones off, Terry, because it's really quite intense, isn't it? Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, that's better, because that's going to be exhausting. I'm just going to have to. I trust that it's all going to sound all right. There's nothing we can do about the background noise. The interesting thing is, I met with some people last night, and wonderful group, spirit group we call ourselves, and we're sort of looking at the Steiner and anthroposophical kind of principles. And Yvette, who's sort of doing our teaching, she talked about that sunrise and sunset is the pinnacle of good. I'm using good and evil, not evil necessarily, but the kind of, it is the time of, and this is not a reference to religion, church religion, this is kind of spiritual sort of context. The Christ energy is highest at midnight, at sunrise and sunset. So that makes a lot of sense. Why is that important though, Terry, physiologically? Like, what happens when we breathe, the oxygen that's come out of this Java almond, what is that actually, or the breath that's come out of the lungs of an eagle, what is that doing in our bodies? I'm sort of referencing Zach Bush here too.
Yeah, I think it's actually adding to our internal microbiome then, because every part of our body has its own individual microbiome. So your hand has got a different microbiome. So the front of your hand, for example, has got a different microbiome to the back of your hand. Your nose, your mouth, your lungs, your gut, different parts of your gut have all got different microbiomes. And so we're run by that biology. We think that we're running the place, but we're actually being run. And right through to our moods, are determined by that biology. So I think, just getting access to the natural biology. I think any form of nature, whether it's the sounds, whether it's the smell, whether it's just the feel of it, the breathing in those biomes, because this air around us is just full of microbes. It's full of stuff.
Yeah.
And we're just taking that in, and some of it, I think we're probably going to reject. Our body will reject, and some of it it'll handle and take on board.
Terry, I was just thinking, this Java almond. I guess it's from Java. One would suspect. I mean, the fact that we're sitting under it, we're being exposed to a biome that we may not normally be exposed to. I mean, I'm thinking like kind of continent where our bodies are. I guess we'll get to it. McCosker, where's that? What origins? What part of UK?
Well, it's Irish.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure whether it's Irish or Scottish. There is a theory that we started in Scotland in the 1600s, and we're part of the problem in Northern Ireland. The Protestants that went across and settled Northern Ireland. But when I got to Ireland and tracked down my relatives, they were all Catholic and they're all on the other side of the line. So
yeah, right.
But then when you start digging into Irish history, it's pretty mixed up. There's plenty of Spanish in there. There's plenty of Scottish in there. There's a bit of English in there. But at the end of the day, it's Irish. And so there, my roots at the moment, and I can trace my maternal grandmother straight back. She emigrated from Ireland at the age of 11.
Yeah.
And my great-grandfather arrived in Brisbane in 1846 from Ireland, and he was a builder, a carpenter. And we come from a long line of what I've heard is poachers and smugglers, because the family lives right on the border, right on the river, and so they,
Poachers and
they
smugglers.
could take stuff from Southern Ireland across into Northern Ireland, take stuff from Northern Ireland back into Southern Ireland, and in the meantime they'd poach a few fish out of the river and so on. But they actually were a long line also of painters and decorators.
Really?
Yeah. So I asked them how they got through the famine, and they said, well, because back in the famine era, painters and decorators were actually a highly recognised art form, because as a painter or a decorator, you actually mixed your own paints, you made your own paints, you created your own wallpaper and all of those sort of things. So they were a pretty highly qualified trade. And so they said what happened during the famine there was, because they were working on big houses for wealthy families, the wealthy families fed them.
So they survived.
Yeah, they got through okay. But
That's fascinating. Do you think they poached the stuff they poached and smuggled? They might have then used in the decoration. Did they smuggle wallpaper?
No, I don't think so. I think that
combining the two skills.
I think what they poached and smuggled was more about food and feeding themselves. Yeah. Feeding their families and feeding other families.
Yeah, right. Well, you've done. That's a lovely segue. We've gone back further than I was going to, but that's fantastic. I guess my point back to the Javanese. You, as an Irish person, your biology over eons, smelling the biology of a plant that's very foreign. I guess that in itself is an interesting concept. How the body actually responds to that and the memory of that. I mean, there's actually something in. What's that stuff in
genetics?
No, well, I'm thinking more is it hemp, that we have receptors in our bodies for, is it THC or one of those CBD or one of those active ingredients in hemp, that our bodies actually have in them receptors for that very chemical that wouldn't receive anything until that enters the body. So isn't it fascinating that even you do? I'm sure they weren't growing hemp in Ireland back then, but somehow your body has that in it. Terry, this we're tangenting already. I might have to put a sign up and ask these blokes just not to drive past. They're just doing laps. Terry, this is about your regenerative journey, and we've already gone back to the 1800s, which is fantastic. Now there's a bloody tractor. Sorry, listeners, we might just let him go. Sponsored by Kubota. Clearly, it's all Kubota gear. Hopefully they're knocking off soon, if they started early. Terry, this is about your regenerative journey. How far back do you want to go? Let's go back to birth of Terry McCosker. Where did that take place? Into what sort of situation? What were the early years of Terry like?
I was born in a little town called Wandai, which is in the South Burnett region of Queensland. Raised for the first 13 years of my life on a very small dairy farm. We milked about 30 cows, as did everyone else in the district. We separated that out, and the pigs got the skim milk, and the cream went off to the butter factory. And then the butter factory produced the butter. The butter then went by train. Somehow or other it ended up in Brisbane, and then that jumped on ships and they went across to Britain. And then in the 60s, Britain joined what was then called the Common Market, which now people know as the EU. And so they stopped buying product like butter from the colonies and started buying it from the Common Market. And that just killed the dairy industry in Queensland overnight. So the dairy industry, when I grew up, there was 55,000 dairy farms in Queensland at the time. That was in the late 50s and into the 60s. And that survived through probably to the late 60s. And then once that butter market went, all our small dairies just shut down. All the butter factories shut down, dairy shut down. We were on a farm where we grew pigs, we grew maize, peanuts, and what happened was we're actually one of the first farms in Queensland where the issue of tree clearing on slopes created salt in the valleys. And we had one water source, we had two actually, a dam, which didn't always fill. It was only a little puddle when I look at it today. And we had a well that was only about 6 or 8 feet deep. And that well went salty. And we didn't know it for a number of years. The salt gradually built and gradually built, because as the trees were cleared, and it was brigalow country, we're clearing the trees off the tops of the ridges, that changed the water cycle, it changed the water table in the valleys. And the water table started rising up close to the surface and would go down and close. Every time it came up, it would leave salt behind and go back down, come up and leave salt behind. Anyway, what happened was the dairy cows weren't milking all that well, and their hides just went, I can still remember it, their hides were just hard and leathery. And Dad got the local vet out, and eventually he diagnosed it as salt toxicity. It was the water. And anyway, so we couldn't use that water anymore. So then I remember Dad with this little Fergie T20 and a little 1,000-gallon pod on the back of it on a trailer, and he would drive in every day into the butter factory and come back with 1,000 gallons of water to water the animals. And we lived off water tanks, and so we grew up in what today you'd class as absolute poverty. We basically had nothing. We ate, if we had calves, we would kill a calf and eat the veal. Occasionally we'd kill a pig. We'd grow our own pumpkins and things like that. And but we had no money, and we also had no water. So we had no running water in the house, and I can still remember that we would all have a bath once a week, all in the same water, about 2 or 3 inches deep in the bottom of the bath, the whole family, and there were 7 of us. And that was our hygiene. We only and that was all the water we had. So it was just, and it wasn't just us, it was the whole district lived like that. It was just normal.
And was that through particularly dry times, or that was kind of normal?
It was basically normal, because the house had no running water. We had no hot water in the house. So we had a wood stove, and the only hot water we had was a little thing on the side of the stove. And so if the stove wasn't going, we had no hot water. And but we didn't know that wasn't what you do. Sort of, you look back on it now and you think, oh, that's a bit abnormal, having a bath once a week. And we must have stunk. I'll tell you what, but when going to school,
talk about biomes.
Yeah, well, I mean, I reckon it's one of the reasons I'm so healthy today.
Yeah.
Because I can still recall as a kid, I must have been 8 or 9, and in the morning, the pigs were a bit sick, and in the morning before going to school, I'd go down with Dad, and he'd catch the pigs, and I'd inject them with penicillin. And then we had these bloody big needles, the old glass type ones, and so my job was to inject them. And then I'd go straight from there to school, straight from the pig pen to school. And but I didn't smell it because we were used to it. But the poor teachers, and yet there was kids on our road that we thought were poor compared to us.
Yeah, well.
That were much worse off than us. And they only had pumpkins to eat. Well, we had a bit more than pumpkins to eat. And then often we would finish a meal and still be hungry because there wasn't enough food on the table. And again, I can remember Dad, who was a Second World War vet. So, he left the war in 46, and we're now talking in the 50s. So it wasn't very long. And most of his mates were returned servicemen in town. Anzac Day was a big day for him. And but I can remember him would still give us the last food off his plate. He'd been out working all day. We might have been at school. We were still hungry at the end of a meal, and he'd give us his lamb chop or something, And so I reckon I picked up my humanity from Dad, and to come out of that war, and he fought for 4 years, and he was a very, very human person, a very loving and giving person, and he set up lots of things in the district. He established the local show, and built the showgrounds. Did all, was on the school committee, was on all that sort of stuff, which back in those days, it was a community, and there was, local dances, and everyone got together, and, all that sort of stuff. So that was, I guess, my upbringing there, but I guess Mum loved that land, and they bought that property off her father.
I was going to say, so she was from there?
She was from there, yeah.
Right.
And she absolutely loved the land, and I got the love of the land from her. And horses, we grew up on horseback. My first buster was at 3, and I can still remember it clear as day.
I still saw.
Yeah, but I climbed up on a horse that I shouldn't have been on, and I can remember this too. The horse was tied up in the yards, and I climbed up the rails on the fence, and then jumped across onto the saddle. And the horse must have got a fright and just spun around, and I just hit the ground. I had plenty more busters after that too, but that was first one I really remember.
At 3, good on you.
Yeah. So then that place, we actually had to sell it in '63, and we moved to another dairy farm down closer to Brisbane, which was then a whole milk farm.
So what made, just a question on that, I'm just interested, was it butter was the thing when you're at Wandai because of transport? Like you just couldn't get the milk from there to where it could be drunk, so butter was an easy way to transport it?
It was butter, yeah, because there was no refrigeration back then. When we moved down closer to Brisbane, we still didn't have electricity, so we had no electricity either. So that was the 50s, early 60s. We left there in '63. We moved down to near Caboolture, which is an hour out of Brisbane. In '63, still no electricity. We got electricity there in '65. So first 15 years of my life, we'd never experienced electricity. We'd never experienced running water. I didn't experience a flushing toilet till I left home and went to study and lived in Brisbane. That was sort of, it was a basic upbringing, but it was brilliant. I just loved it. My childhood, I love it, and it's responsible for the microbiome that I have today and the constitution that I have today. Living and working in horse shit, cow shit, pig shit, and working with the soil. And we worked as kids from the time I learnt to drive the tractor at 8, and I was pulling stumps out with Dad. He would put the chain on the stump, and I was on the tractor when I was 8. And I can still remember the first stump we tried to pull out. It was too big for the tractor, and the tractor reared up, and I had no idea what to do.
Oh, you were in the seat?
I was in the seat, and the tractor was at about 45 degrees, and Dad raced around and jammed his hand on the clutch, and the tractor fell back down to the ground, and he just said, that's all you need to do.
Remember that next time.
Yeah, remember that next time. You just need to put your foot on the clutch if it starts to rear.
Yeah, so get out, you can't do that.
No,
that's too dangerous.
And then it was continue on. Well, he needed help.
Yeah, totally.
And, I remember at 11, I milked the entire herd. Mum and Dad were away one night for some reason or other, and I got home from school, and I decided I'd just have all the milking done by the time they got home.
And that's by hand?
No, we had machines.
You had machines.
Yeah, but the only thing I couldn't do was screw the separator down to the right tension in the separator, so the milk was still sitting in the vat when they got home. But,
but I mean, you didn't have to do that.
No, but it was helping them out,
Totally.
Otherwise they'd have had to start milking in the dark, and as I say, we had no electricity and would have been lanterns. But it was a great life. I loved it.
Just something that often comes up, Terry, is as a reference point, and I've said it before and I'll say it again, my grandfather he signed up for the First World War when he was 15, and he turned 16 on the boat over there with his horse and his saddle and his bridle, and whatever else he had with him. And I wouldn't have known my head from my arse when I was 15. Like, to do that is amazing. I've no doubt you could have done it, given what we've just learned. But I guess what I'm challenged by is, and this is not trying to sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but challenged by whether you call it attitude, the character, the integrity, the kind of the wherewithal of our current and our future generations. And I'm kind of alerted to that? You know, do you share similar concerns, or maybe not concerns, but kind of thinking around? You know, I don't expect people to go and live without electricity, but you know, some of the things I see and hear, I think, gee whiz, you know, if they're under any sort of duress, if they walked into a house and there was no electricity, it would be the end of the world.
Yeah, and I have real concerns because, you know, in Australia today, just take diesel. We're 3 weeks away. If something happens seriously, we're 3 weeks away from being out of diesel. That means we have no trucks, we have no food being delivered. We would probably still have power if we're still allowed to use coal, but everything stops. The farming will stop, the food production will stop, the food distribution will stop, and we're 3 weeks away from that.
Yeah.
And so I think, and it really concerns me because they're, you know, I think my kids grew up a lot softer than I grew up, but you know, we were broke when they were growing up, so they grew up reasonably tough as well. They're resilient. But I'm really concerned about some of our grandkids. You know, I got a 10-year-old grandson now, and his father still cuts his meat up. You know, when he sits down to a meal, and I you don't like to interfere, but you think, my God. I was driving tractors, milking cows, blowing stumps out at that age, which is something I learnt early on, was how to blow stumps out of the ground.
What with
which was
urea
fun.
No,
ammonium nitrate and diesel.
Yeah,
and detonators and fuse, and Dad and I would get out there and we'd dig the holes under.
I bet you didn't get that little ticket at the TAFE course, Terry.
I did.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, too right. Later on, when I started studying ag, this was still back in this, when was I? 60s when I started studying ag. Part of our course was how to blow out stumps, and so
as a practical farming
activity. Tool, because machinery wasn't very. You got to remind, machinery wasn't big in those days.
No.
We just come out of the Second World War. All these blokes are used to blowing things up, and so
I guess so.
You know, loud noises were not foreign to them.
No,
and so and we were just. It was just natural. That was the only way we could get them out of the ground, and so and it was part of the course that I learnt. So here I was, you know, probably 6-7 years later, officially learned how to blow stumps out of the ground.
Yeah, give me that. I'll show you how to bloody do it.
Yeah.
So what is that? I guess. What's the antidote for that? For that kind of, I don't know, upbringing or
adversity is the antidote to it, and I suspect that we're headed for some of it. You know, unfortunately. Things come in cycles. Everything cycles. Nature cycles, the carbon cycles, politics cycle, human cycle, economy cycle, and there's a perception today that we're on this gravy train that can just continue, and you can't. You know, in terms of humans at the moment, we're somewhere between 50 and 60% overstocked to the carrying capacity of Earth, and so something's going to happen in the next few years somewhere. It could happen tomorrow, it could happen in 2 years, 5 years, I don't know when, but the gravy train we're on right now is going to come crashing down. And so you know, I talk with my kids about this, and we're all on the same page. We all know that where we're at right now is not, it's not the future necessarily. So in other words, the past is not necessarily the future. And when you step right back and look at the larger political cycles globally, where you have empires that build and then empires that collapse, and empires that build and empires that collapse. And so the US empire was the last empire to build, and you can see now that US empire is collapsing and crumbling. And as the power of the US collapses and crumbles, and now you can see that the next empire is potentially built by China and or alliances with the dictators. And so the world order, as we expected, of being orderly and nice, that actually hasn't been normal for the last, 8,000-10,000 years of what we call civilization. these things come in cycles, and so we're likely to head back into a cycle now where things get progressively worse globally, and that will impact Australia. It'll impact us individually, and therefore resilience, our personal resilience, is something that I don't know how we get back into the population generally, but you take the floods, take the stuff that's happening right now. When adversity hits, resilience reappears, community reappears, people start working together, start thinking together, and I think that's, as big issues hit us, we will head back to the things that work, which is community and working together and helping one another, and resilience.
So I guess that old phrase, there's no growth stimulant like pain. And that we all might have to, in varying degrees and situations, experience that pain, that adversity. Now I guess what people do at that time is will be based on their previous experience of adversity and how they learnt and could cope, and then I guess there's potentially a lot of people who just will not know the first thing to do. Whether it's an immediate adversity like there's no fuel or no food, or a long-term political one, or whatever. It is.
So my family and I are personally preparing for food shortages.
Yeah.
And the reason is that my parents came through the Great Depression, and my parents instilled in us never be without a piece of land that you can grow food on. So that if we ever go back through another Great Depression, you can at least grow your own food and eat. And it's the people who can't produce their own food or eat who are going to be in the most trouble. And so we're deliberately doing things, and have been for some time, trying to get more self-sufficient in food, or being able to get by with whatever.
We're power.
Yep.
Power too?
Power's an issue, and when I analysed that, the power issue actually came back to fuel. And so, because if we've got to go to work, or we've got to go to town, or we've got to do something, how do we actually get there without fuel? And so I've got a couple of camels. I'll hook them up to a dray or a trailer, or we can walk to town or ride a bike to town. So that bit doesn't worry me. But if the grid goes off, I've got a genset. That's fine. But where do I get the fuel from for the genset? Then how do I get to a Bowser to get that fuel for the genset? So we're thinking through those issues at the moment, and it's not an easy one to get around. So I haven't overcome that yet.
No, but I guess the good news is there are options, and it's all about preparation, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Preemptive kind of stuff. Well, I'm glad we went there. I didn't even think that was going to come up, but it was kind of obvious point there. Terry, I want to. So 13, you went from Wondai to Caboolture. Was it 13?
Yeah.
Milk dairy there.
Yeah.
What happened then?
Well, my ambition was to become a dairy farmer. So I've got a couple of claims to fame. First one was that I failed primary school.
How do you fail primary school?
I couldn't pass grade 6 or 7.
What actually tested? There were tests, were there?
Oh yeah. They had to get tested. Back in those days, you got scores.
Yeah, right.
A, B, C, or D.
Yep.
D was a fail.
Yeah, right.
And it didn't matter. It was okay to fail people.
You were good at D's, were you?
I was good at D's. And so I was a failure, and so eventually I had to repeat. I think it was grade 7 I repeated, and then so I had to repeat that a year in primary school, and then got into high school, and I couldn't complete high school either. I was too dumb to complete high school, and so I was. And
by their standards.
By their standards, and I guess what I realised today is that I wasn't actually stupid or didn't have the ability to learn. it was the way in which we were taught things, and it was the educational process that didn't agree with, or I didn't agree with. I suppose I rebelled against the educational process and the way things were pumped, or with rote learning and all that sort of stuff, and just didn't suit my way of learning. Anyway, I got to high school and discovered ag science. And in grade 9, I think, I had a high school teacher there who I'll talk a little bit about, because he's had a massive influence on my life. And I started doing a couple of ag subjects, animal husbandry and agriculture. And the first exam we did, I got A's. And I thought,
You nerd.
yeah, what the heck? I've never got an A in my life. I fail things.
Yeah.
And these A's, and it continued. And I just loved it. I just lapped it up. And so I knew that's where my future was. But my goal was to become a dairy farmer. I just wanted to go home and milk the cows.
You were already a dairy farmer, I guess, weren't you? It was to continue
I was,
that whole thing.
Yeah. And fortunately, Dad said to me, because I had the chat with him one night. I remember we were walking back from the dairy, and I think, all the wisdom summoned up by about a 13-year-old, and I said to him, Dad, I might have been 14 even. I said, I'd like to come back and run the farm. And he said, no. He said, none of you are coming back to this place. You're all going away to get a profession or a trade or something else, but none of you coming back to the farm. That just shattered my dreams, Anyway, but I want to talk a little bit about this high school teacher, how a teacher can change a life. And this bloke, John Fletcher, who's still alive today, and I've had 3 amazing privileges in the last 10 years, and because John changed my life, and he ensured that I actually passed some of my high school subjects. And then in, I don't know what year it was, probably about 2014, 12, 13, somewhere about there, the high school decided to award me, put me on their Wall of Fame, they call it. And there was only about 6 people on the Wall of Fame, and I got inducted that one night with Keith Urban. Keith Urban and I were inducted at the same time. We both come from Caboolture High.
Really?
Yeah, so we were both inducted the same night into the Caboolture Wall of Fame. Anyway, so that...
And when did this happen? When was this induction?
About 2014 or something like that. And anyway, I was going to take Fletch down to that, because he taught me in that high school. And he rang me up the day before and he said, my back's so bad I just can't come. I said, Fletch, righto. About 2 years later, Central Queensland University conferred on me an honorary doctorate of agribusiness. I was able to take John to that, and that was 50 years after he'd first influenced me, and I was able to take that teacher to that ceremony. And then the first person I rang when I got an OAM was John Fletcher.
Oh.
Yeah.
What age would he have been when you were at school?
Well, he can't have been much older than us, actually. He would have been in his early 20s.
Yeah.
And he knew Mum and Dad really well, and he still remembers the whole family. He asked me all about all my siblings,
Wow.
how are they all going, by name, and he still talks about, getting on the grog with Dad, and so, yeah.
What was it about him, like, because you've jumped to the future, or the closer to the present with the sort of how you've kind of acknowledged that with him, but what happened at school that really got you?
I think it was, he actually gave us our head and allowed us to learn in the ways that we could learn, which was different from what I think ways I'd been taught. And so he was, when he needed to be, he was one of the boys. When he needed to be, he could discipline us, but he didn't do that very often. But he just had fun with us, and we had fun learning, and And he was enjoying it and we were enjoying it, and I think that was probably the major difference. But he was passionate about what he was doing. He wanted us to learn, and I guess he felt that, you know, we had a bit of potential as well, and we were going to lose it if we didn't.
We being a couple of your other classmates?
Yeah, other mates, yeah, in class, yeah. There was only 11 of us in doing ag.
Yeah.
We were a very tight-knit group.
So he was very influential. What? So you finished up school there?
Yeah.
And then where did you take your
I went
ag
directly
interest?
from there into Queensland DPI. So I went straight from high school into Queensland DPI as a cadet. You can't. There was only a very small window where that was even possible, without any qualifications, without even finishing grade 12, and I went straight into a job in Queensland DPI. And because I was actually off a dairy farm, and was a pretty practical sort of bloke, I think I joined DPI when I was 17. Well, by the time I was 18, I published my first paper, which had never been done before, and I also was let loose as an extension officer around Brisbane. So there was lots of people with 25 acres and 30 acres and 50 acres that wanted to grow a pasture, run a few head of cattle and that sort of stuff. So the guys that my bosses at DPI, they just gave me a ute and said, "Listen, you go out and sort these blokes out." So from about 18, I was an extension officer, but I was also working in research. My proper position was actually an assistant to the local agrostologist. So I was his sort of gopher, and we were doing a lot of work on soil fertility around phosphorus nutrition, mostly in dairy pastures and dairy pastures. So I spent 4 years doing that in Brisbane and studied at the same time. And then Brisbane was a real novelty for a while. First flushing toilet, first running water,
Oh, wow.
you know, all that sort of stuff. But that novelty wore off. And then after about 4 years, I said to the guys in DPI, I want to get out of Brisbane. They said, "Where do you want to go?" I said, "I want to go to North Queensland." They said, "Right, you can go to North Queensland." So I got transferred in the end of 71 up to South Johnson Research Station near Innisfail in North Queensland, the wet tropics. So I went from the dairy industry then to the beef industry. And I was working in the dairy industry right around southeast Queensland as a cadet at that stage, and then went into the beef industry, still on pastures, still on soils. And then I felt after I was there about 7 years, I think I was there, and for the last probably 3 or 4 of those, I was thinking, I'm not making a contribution to agriculture here in what I'm doing. And so what I ended up doing was putting all my efforts into the community. I was on about 7 or 8 different local community groups. I was in JC's, Toastmasters. Pam and I set up Meals and Wheels in Innisfail. We were in the local theatre. On and on and on it went.
You
stood for council.
Thespian, Terry.
Yeah. Then I stood for council, and I couldn't string 2 words together, and I spent 7 years in Toastmasters, and I never missed a meeting in 7 years. That's once a fortnight.
And that was a local chapter, like that,
Local
how they
chapter,
worked.
yeah,
Right.
and it was absolutely brilliant, and one of the best organisations I've ever been in.
Really? I better make a note of that. Toastmasters. I've heard a lot about it. I've never been to one, but you reckon that was, and that's all about public speaking. Your confidence, and
Yeah, I can remember one
Pretty
guy
confident now,
came in there because he was going to get married in about a year's time, and he knew he had to give a speech. He was a plumber,
Prepping.
and he was prepping. And the first time he stood up in front of the group, his mouth opened, and he absolutely froze.
Yeah.
And then he sat down. And he came back 2 weeks later, and he stood up, opened his mouth, absolutely froze, went and sat down. I got to give him A for effort. He came back again. And the 3rd week, he got some words out.
Yeah, well.
By the end of that year, he was able to deliver his speech at his wedding. That's life-changing.
Well, I mean, that's pretty preemptive stuff. Imagine if he'd gone 3 weeks out, I better just practice that speech. He'd have been buggered.
Yeah. No, he was a gutsy bloke.
So community activities, you mentioned that you were kind of didn't feel like you were contributing. I'm sure you were contributing to individual farmers in a big way, and the support you were giving them. But there was a sense of that you had more to offer.
In North Queensland, I wasn't. I was stuck on the research station, and I wasn't connected to the industry. And I think that was probably where my really underlying issues were, because I'd been totally connected when I was in Brisbane and on the farm, and then I lost that connection when I went onto the research station, and that made me really uneasy. And I just, how do I know that what we're doing is real or relevant or has got any economic value for people? And that really concerned me. And so the boss I was working for at the time picked up a consulting job in the Territory for an American group, and then he and I probably weren't hitting it off all that well, and so he recommended me to take a job in the Northern Territory. And so
that was
he said, well,
that's how it works.
He said, do you want to go over and interview for this job? And I thought, yeah, I will.
And you went, no. He went, no, you want to go and interview for that job.
It was a good way of getting rid of me. Yeah. Anyway, because I'd gone flying, actually. I'd got my commercial pilot's license, and I was going to fly commercially, and that's how I was going to get out of the DPI. Yeah, I was. My next step was to get an ag rating, because I was going to stay in agriculture, and I was going to become an ag pilot, and I was going to buy out the local ag pilot's business and his aircraft. And thankfully I didn't, otherwise I'd have probably been crippled by chemicals or praying into a hill somewhere.
So being an ag pilot, you're essentially, you're not carting passengers, you're carting chemicals.
Yeah, that's what it was about. And at that stage chemical, this is like, we're talking 70s now, and use of chemicals and fertilisers, that was it, like the gung-ho approach to everything.
So was there a fair bit of that going on?
Oh, that's what it was all about. The total focus of all our branches in DPI that were involved in, the broad-scale agriculture and the dairy industry. There was 2 CSIRO divisions, all aimed at introduced pastures, fertilisers, intensification, all using continuous grazing.
Yep.
And which I didn't sort of understand that nuance at the time. But no, there was a massive focus on pastures back in the 60s and 70s.
So was there glyphosate getting around then, or
no,
variations on?
It wasn't around. There was
a bit of spray seed.
Back then we had gramoxone, and we had some really good ones. Yeah.
Oh, that's the stuff that just burns your nose out. We used to use a lot of that.
Yeah.
Filthy stuff.
Oh yeah, it's dangerous stuff.
So that's kind of on the land, and then what about sort of chemical use in cattle? Were there many backlines then? What was the kind of the chemical treatments?
No, not much because the Brahman was very common in Northern Australia at that stage, and so dipping had pretty well gone out the window. A little bit of dipping, not much, but buffalo fly was probably the biggest issue. So there was a bit of work on buffalo fly, trying to control them. But they just developed resistance to whatever you started using really quickly.
So no flying, but not your own business then?
No. So I finished. I had a brand new commercial licence, and then this job came up in the Territory, and so I said, yeah, I'll go over for an interview. So, and they flew Pam and I and my son Sean, over, and we landed in Darwin and went down to the station, and it was a 3-day interview. And there was, I think, 3 Americans there, and myself, basically, and we drove around paddocks for 2 or 3 days and sat down in the office for a while and had a yarn. And at the end of that 3 days, they said, "Well, you've got the job," and I said, "Well, I don't want it."
Was it a research station?
No, it's cattle station.
No, it was like proper, okay.
Station. Yeah. The job definition was that they wanted somebody who knew something about growing grass. That was the job description.
Well, that was quite novel back then, I guess.
Well, it was, yeah. And that was sort of my background. So I said, no, I don't want it. And they said, why not? And I said, look, I know nothing about this environment. Firstly, I've never worked in the extensive beef industry. I've never worked in the dry tropics. I don't know these trees. I don't know these grasses. I don't know these soils. I've never worked with an extensive breeder herd. The biggest herd I've ever worked is 30 head of cows. And they had 12,000, and And it was scary to me. And so I said, no, I don't.
You age what? We're just
I was 27.
It's true, yeah.
And so they said no. They said, no, we want somebody who has no preconceived ideas. And that clicked with me. And you would not believe how that paid off. Because what I said to them, I said, just go to the local DPI, pick up somebody that knows what they're doing. And they said, no, we want somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. And that was incredibly brave when you think about that. How many businesses would hire a kid at the age of 27? Eventually they gave me the property and said, not give it away like in terms of ownership, but said, fix it. And gave me unlimited resources to fix it. As a 27-year-old kid who knew nothing. If you imagine how brave that is.
Well, I guess they would have seen character, wouldn't they? I mean, you
must
hire
have,
on character and you
Yeah.
not necessarily skills.
And I suppose they appreciated that honesty.
Was this a corporate mob or a family mob?
Oh, corporate. Massive corporate. They were, well, it was actually a family corporate. It was a company called W.R. Grace. And the head of the company at that time was J. Peter Grace III. And the company was 125 years old.
Is that American? When you said you've got the third, that's an American kind of thing, isn't it?
But they were Irish. So J. Peter Grace I had left Ireland as a 16-year-old cabin boy on a ship and ended up in the Atlantic. And then he ended up on ships that were collecting guano, shipping it back to the US as phosphate fertiliser. He ended up owning the shipping line.
Wow.
Then in their second iteration, they owned Pan Am. Then they own the Florida rock deposits, which is still the major source of rock phosphate in the US today. And then became an international global conglomerate. And Peter Grace used to fly out twice a year in his private jet and bring 3 secretaries with him, 3 or 4 pilots, and he would leave New York and fly straight to Darwin. They'd stop once for fuel. And it was about a 24-hour trip. And we would jump in a ute and he would want to sit in the back and we'd just go bush. And he just wanted to drive around, see brumbies, see buffalo run around, see cattle. He just wanted the open skies, and nobody around him that knew who he was. And, one of his best mates was Ronald Reagan. One of his other mates was Bob Hope. We'd sit down under a tree and he'd start telling Bob Hope jokes. It was pretty relaxed when he was there. And then, so they bought this big chunk of country because it was cheap, but they were losing money hand over fist. And back in the 70s, when I joined them, they were losing $1 million a year. And $1 million a year in the 70s was a lot of money.
Gee whiz.
And so that's why they wanted somebody to fix it. And
they had nothing to lose, did they? I mean,
they actually didn't have much to lose at that stage, and that might be why they made the decision they made. We'll back a kid.
Yeah.
So anyway, they said, well. So I started work with them, and then I drove around for 6 months, and I looked at all the problems, and I came back after 6 months, and I said to them, and I wrote a little report, sent it off to New York, and said, look. Your issues are too big. Just sell up and get out.
Really?
And they said, well, we're not used to walking away from a problem. What do we need to do? So being 27 and full of crap, I just said, well, give me $1 million in 3 years and I'll sort it out for you then. And they said, well, you better do it. And I thought, oh, geez, what have I just got myself into? And they said, no, we're serious. You design a research project to overcome all our problems.
Yeah.
So I did. And I sent this research project off to them and designed all these experiments and all this stuff. And my gut was saying there's something wrong. It was just screaming at me, my intuition. Anyway, the manager at that stage, who I worked very closely with, a fellow called Cliff Emerson, and he was a Texan, and he had a master's degree in rangeland management. Anyway, I said to Cliff, there's something wrong here. And he said, what is it? I said, I don't know, but there's something wrong. He said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, the only thing I can think to do is I'm going to go back to Queensland and I'm going to start in Mareeba, and I'm going to drive to Brisbane, and I want to talk to everybody I know between Mareeba and Brisbane. And I knew everyone, because I knew all the CSIRO people, all the DPI people, all the experts. So he said, righto, away you go. So I did that, and what happened, and it took me about 3 weeks to do that trip. And every time I explained my problems to people, the actual issues become clearer.
Yeah.
And it wasn't what anyone ever said, it was actually me explaining it over and over and over.
It was in there, you just had to kind of
I had to get it out.
get it out.
So obviously my subconscious knew what was wrong,
Yeah, right.
because it was saying to me, you got a problem here. Right, but I didn't know what was wrong. So gradually, every time I explained it slightly differently. And it came out. By the time I got to Brisbane, I knew what the problems were. So I flew back to Darwin and drove back to the station, and it was a Friday afternoon. I still remember this very clearly. And Cliff came up and he said, righto, what'd you find? And I said, I found we've got to go 180 degrees in the direction we've been going in. And everything I said in that research project is wrong.
Really?
And he just went, "Arr, shit." And so we sat down on my front lawn for the next 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, and argued. At the end of 2 days, I had him convinced I was right. That everything they'd been doing for the last, 12, 13 years was wrong. And it was all based on existing research and existing science. And so, so here was I, going against all conventional wisdom. So I sent off a report then by telex to New York to say, I've changed my mind.
Forget that.
Yeah, forget that, what I just sent you. Here's another one. We're going 180 degrees away from that. That was all wrong. Well, it was about 5 or 6 days later, 3 of these guys flew out from New York they were coming out to approve the budget for my first trials results, right? Anyway, meantime, I'd given them another one. I didn't give them a budget, I just gave them a different concept. So they drove down to the station in a couple of hire cars, and I had a little report ready on what we needed to do. They just grabbed that, jumped in the cars, just grunted, went straight back to Darwin. And we didn't hear from them for another 4 days. Eventually they came back, and we found out after that they'd actually spent those 4 days on the phone trying to replace Cliff and I because we'd lost it.
Yeah, right. They went, this is rubbish.
This is rubbish.
You've lost it.
We've got to get rid of these 2 blokes, right?
Wow.
So anyway, then they decided, well, we couldn't get rid of them that fast, so they're going to come down and have it out and get rid of us face to face. So they came down, and we sat in the shed, and we had a big whiteboard, and I drew up a diagram and of where they'd been and where they needed to go. And we, same thing, just argued for nearly 3 days. I was shouting up, down, roundabout, and I just stuck to my guns. I just stayed with logic. And at the end of that period, they said, yeah, rightio, put together another research project to solve all of those problems you've just identified. And so I did. And it took us 5 years and about $1.5 million, and we solved every problem we set out to solve, and a whole heap that we didn't know were there when we started. And that was massive scale research work done within the context of a system. And what I learned out of that was about systems. And so because of the resources they gave me, they allowed me to have experts in any field from anywhere in the world. And so I would bring in, say, a soil expert, and he'd say, all you need to do with his blinkers on is fix that, and 90% of your problems will be fixed. You bring in an ecologist, all you need to do is fix that, 90% of your problems are fixed. Reproductive physiologist, you just fix that. A nutritionist, you just fix that. And so what I learnt to do was pick bits out of all of that and build a system. And And so there were some of them only ever consulted for me once, and they wouldn't do it again because I didn't accept their advice. But by listening to their advice and realising it didn't fit, it was probably sound advice somewhere else, but it wasn't sound advice for what I needed to achieve. And they didn't know the system that I was trying to put together. They're looking at it from a sort of a narrow perspective of a discipline. But when you're running a property or a business, it's holistic. It's everything. It's business. It's people. You know, it's landscape. It's ecology. It's the weather. It's the, you know, it's everything. And it's the production system, and all of those things have got to come together. So, well, what I learned to do was actually pull together stuff from everywhere and synthesise systems and work at a systems level, which I later learned is the same thing as holistic, being holistic. But I didn't know that word back then.
So just, you mentioned it before, Terry, like there was your 180 degree to turn to you was logical, but that was going against all of the science.
Yes.
So what was it that what was logical to you about it that no one had seen before? You know, like what was like maybe what was some of the conventional thinking and the 180 degree thinking that you applied? You know, I'm imagining it's grazing, it's other ecological kind of indicators. Like why was it logical to you, and even all the science to that data was against it?
I think one thing was, so firstly I came from the science background, so I'd read the literature. So I knew what they were trying to achieve and why they were trying to achieve it. But what I'd probably done that a lot of those scientists hadn't done is I spent 6 months on a motorbike riding around a couple of 100,000 acres in detail, surveying it, looking for what was there. And I wasn't finding what I thought was supposed to be there, but I was finding weeds, lots of them. I was finding bare ground, I was finding degraded systems, and I wasn't finding the improved pastures that had been put in. And they'd planted at that stage probably 70, 80, 100,000 acres of improved pastures, and I found 6,000 acres of it. And so, and then the first year there, we ordered 12,000 tonnes of superphosphate. It'd come up from Perth.
And this is in the territory?
Yeah.
I didn't know they used...
Road trains coming up constantly for months, and then flew it all on.
Yeah.
And then I thought, okay, what are we doing here? We're trying to grow a legume or a plant in order to get protein into these cows, and we're putting the phosphorus on in order to grow the legume and get phosphorus into the cow. That's not working. Why don't we just feed the phosphorus and the protein to the cow? That was the first thing. The second one was the difference between the wet season and the dry season. There's an assumption, and there had been an assumption in all the research, is that the problems in the north are actually in the dry season. And all the research had focused on how do we keep animals alive in the dry? How do we get production out of them in the dry? My first wet season, driving around and observing thousands of animals, I realised that the problems were actually in the wet.
Yeah, right.
And when I went back to the literature, I found it was there. The productivity was extremely low in the wet season. And then I thought, well, it is ridiculous to fight against the lack of protein and energy in the dry season when we've got a lack of protein and energy in the wet season, but it's easier to work with. Why don't we work with it when it's green and fix up the protein and energy issues and get our productivity then? Because we can only get our increased productivity in the wet, and we weren't getting it.
Yeah.
That was probably the biggest breakthrough. So my focus switched from the dry season to the wet season, and that was the breakthrough. And that was, but to do that, we had to change systems. So instead of thinking about pastures, I said, right, we've got to go directly to these cows. But we had, the first year I was there, cow mortality was 24%.
True.
The second year I was there, cow mortality, 23%. Right? Something wrong with the system when that's happening. Branding rates, well under 40%. well under 50%.
That's a lot
Closer to
of. That's a lot of
40%.
cows if there's 12,000 cows there.
Yeah. So there was massive issues with animal production, which was staring me in the face. And so I said, right, the problem's in the wet. Let's feed them protein, energy, and minerals in the wet. Well, not so much energy because the energy's in the grass, but protein and minerals in the wet. Fix that up in the wet and see what happens.
So the protein wasn't there as available because it was just so green and lush and
It's green,
carbohydrate.
but
and,
the protein goes out of the grass in the tropics within 10 weeks of when it starts growing. And so it looks green, you think everything's fine, but your protein's gone. When your protein's gone, your energy intake's lower. So the whole system is starting to slide when you don't see it.
Yep.
And so I said, right, we'll correct that. But what we need to do in terms of pastures is we need to find grass-based pastures. So the system they developed was legumes into native pasture with superphosphate, which was based on the success of superphosphate and clovers in southern Australia. And that's what they were trying to emulate.
Yeah.
But as soon as you increase the stocking rate onto that country, the animals ate the grass out.
Yeah.
And you ended up with legume dominance, which then put too much nitrogen in, then the weeds came in and took over, and you ended up with weeds.
So was it legume dominant because they weren't, the legumes weren't as palatable, or they just went for the grass?
They're not palatable in the first half of the wet, and the animals would graze the grass out at the beginning of the wet season.
Yeah, right.
And then there was no balance between protein and energy.
Yeah.
So the system was clearly broken at lots of levels, but it hadn't been recognised anywhere else. And so I convinced them of all of those things. And at the end of the day, they got it because it was pure logic, even though it went against the scientific sort of paradigms of the day.
Well, you were ground truthing everything. I mean, literally out there on your ute and motorbike or whatever, actually observing and going, that actually isn't working, and maybe, I don't know, I guess research can often, in isolation, can give you one thing, but when that research is applied to nature, landscape, it often just doesn't apply, does it?
No. And it was
because of all those other things. The system is like, going, nah, this isn't working.
It was a pretty big deal for me too, because I jumped the fence. I'd come from the research side on into the real world.
You're a trader.
And suddenly, I had to come to accept that everything I thought I knew was actually not right and never going to fit into a system.
Was that because that's kind of, I reckon that's a thing that a lot of people go through, like whether it's, it's a health related thing or it's a business related thing or farming. Was that tough to kind of reconcile and go, everything I knew or I've actually believed in or understood is wrong?
Yeah, well, it took me right back to my childhood, is that I'm useless, I don't know anything. It really, it took me right back to failing.
You're a D man, you weren't an A man.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, right.
And so here I just failed at this too. But I grew confidence out of the success that we actually had by changing the paradigms. And I didn't know they were paradigms at the time either. We just did stuff differently. But
you could have just bailed and gone, I've done a report, I mean, you could have pushed on with that report, I guess, or you could have just gone, nah, it's all just too hard.
Well, I was prepared to bail because I said to them, look, what you're trying to do is not working and it's never going to work, so get out. And I was prepared to just walk away then and find another job somewhere.
Did they ask you to spin that on its head, or was it Cliff that you went, no, I'm actually determined to turn this around?
No, they were the ones who said, well, you better fix it.
Oh, right, okay.
We're not used to walking away from a problem.
Yeah, that's right.
And at that stage, like this is the 70s, they were spending $50 million US a year on R&D in their own company. They had statisticians, private companies, sitting in New York. They had statisticians, they had all sorts of scientists back in their head office, and they were spending $50 million US a year in the 70s on R&D. So they knew that you made money out of R&D. And so they just said, right, we'll just turn it into an R&D project, and you just sort it out. So
that's a big turning point then. I guess you were ground truthing and proving to yourself and the world and to that business that there was more to it than the traditional paradigms that had been running that business for so long.
Yeah.
What was the next step? Did you get poached? Someone go, this bloke knows something?
Well, At one stage I nearly got poached by the Northern Territory government. Well, not so much poached. I was
Smuggled.
no, it actually was. It was my initiation. Actually, I was, for some reason, and this is a great story too. For some reason or other, I was a bit pissed off with something at one stage. So, and there was a Department of Primary Industries local head advertisement in the paper.
Oh, yeah.
So I thought, I didn't have a lot of time for the local DPI. So I wrote this about 3-page letter, totally critical of all the things that were wrong with the DPI. And it wasn't really an application, it was just a bitch session. About 3 weeks later, I get this call. The girl in the office said, the Chief Minister, Paul Everingham's on the phone, would like to talk to you.
So you wrote this letter not as you just went as like just as a kind of a response, kind of like
as an application.
You need to know. Oh, it wasn't an application.
Yeah, but you need to know these are all the things that need to be fixed.
And I'm your man.
Yeah.
Oh, classic. Yeah.
Next minute, the Chief Minister's on the phone. Like, it took about 3 weeks, and he rings up and he says, "Look," he said, "I see you've applied for the director of the Department of Primary Industries." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I really liked your application." And I thought, wow. Anyway, he said, "Well, I don't think you're qualified for the head position." He said, "Why didn't you apply for the 2IC?" And I said, "I didn't see it advertised." He said, "Do you mind then if I sort of go to the public service and get your application dropped down to the 2IC of the department?" I said, "Oh yeah, go for it." So he did. So I went for an interview, interviewed by the Chief Justice and I can't remember who else, but 3 people in the interview panel. And by this stage I really wasn't too keen on moving there. So it was one of these, I don't really give a shit.
Yeah.
You go to the interview, don't really give a shit.
Yeah.
So I did that. And they rang back a few weeks later and said, "We'd like to give you a second interview." And by that time I just chickened out. I said, no way, I'm not coming back. So I pulled out. But the fascinating thing was what happened next was the guys arrived out from New York.
Yeah.
And
because you were still working at the
I'm still on the station.
Yeah.
And so they came down and they were on their way to Singapore after us. And so they said to Pam, they said, "I'll tell you what, we'll cash our first class tickets in and we'll fly you across to Singapore. We'll put you up in the Shangri-La." And they did. They flew her to Singapore, put her up in the Shangri-La, took her around in a limousine, took her shopping, took her to all the shopping centres, put her in centre touring Singapore for about 4 days, took her out to the best restaurants, flew her back to Darwin in a private jet. Nothing was said. And then about 3 weeks later, I was sitting down with one of these guys who'd trained as a diplomat, but he was a senior executive in WA Grace. And old Jim just said to me, he said, "We can offer a lot more advantages than the government."
So they got wind of you having made your application.
I told them. I was up front.
Yeah, classic.
And so
went, "Right, we'll keep this bloke." And did they?
Oh yeah.
Really?
Oh, yeah,
How long?
Oh, I stayed there till it was sold. Then they gave me a huge bonus at the end. They gave me a few bonuses actually. My first bonus, the end of my first year, was a world trip.
Wow.
So they sent me to the US. I'd never been out of Australia at that stage, and I thought I never would. And so my first flight, they fly Darwin, Brisbane, Sydney, Hawaii into LA. And I had arrived in LA, I think about 6 o'clock at night, and I wasn't flying out to New York until the next morning about 4 or 5 o'clock. So I thought, right, I'm off. So I jumped in a cab and went straight to Disneyland.
That's all you knew about the States?
Yeah, and it was all I knew.
Anaheim.
Anaheim, yeah. And I got back to my hotel at 3. I had about 1 hour sleep and then got back to the airport and flew 6 hours to New York. And then I was there. They chauffeured me around New York, took me to restaurants like the Four Seasons and things like that, and then flew me around the States. Then I went to Colombia, then down to Brazil, and back to South Africa, and then back to Perth and home. And I was away for 6 weeks. And when I got back, they said, "Right, what'd you learn?" And I said, "I learned I need to go back to South Africa." And so I went back to South Africa 2 years later and spent another 6 weeks back there. studying phosphorus nutrition and protein nutrition.
So what year is that roughly, just to get a bit of a chronological?
We're now talking, would have been about 79, 80.
Okay.
Yeah, somewhere around that, about 80, yeah. I think I probably did the trip to South Africa in 80 or 81, somewhere about there. Yeah.
And what was the fascination there? What was the kind of why did you think that was going to get you into, or kind of what riddles were they going to solve?
I was doing a lot of work on animal nutrition at that stage, around phosphorus nutrition and protein nutrition, and the South Africans led the world. And so I wanted to get across where they were at and get across their technology and learn from them. And I did. It was wonderful. I visited mostly research stations and scientists, and Rumavite, which are one of the largest feed companies in the world. Yeah, still growing, and have taken over lots of businesses in Australia. So they had really good scientists. So I just learned a lot from them about how protein and phosphorus and energy and all that stuff worked, and came back and just continued to apply that knowledge back into the business and into the research I was doing around in nutrition.
So where did RCS come into it? Like, when did that kind of was that late 80s? Like, where?
So
what was there? Was there something in the middle there though, from the station in Territory?
Yeah. So what happened was the station was sold in '85, and the Northern Territory government then came to me, and the Northern Territory government and the Cattlemen's Association got together and said, we do not want this information lost, because it was groundbreaking information across about 8 different disciplines. And so they paid me for a year to sit down and write it up. And in that year I published 18 papers in 8 different disciplines, each peer reviewed 4 times.
All based on your research there, your experience, your results.
So that was a fantastic learning experience as well, just to get to write all that up. There's probably 2 or 3 PhDs in what I wrote up in that year, and there was world leading stuff. There was discoveries we made there that were the first in the world, like stuff we did first ever in the world.
Like what?
One of them was. I had a problem with bull fertility, and I couldn't figure out what the issue was, but I knew there was a problem with the bulls, and so I set up an experiment to work out how to work out what bulls were worth keeping. But DNA didn't exist back then, and so I found out that blood groups in cows are like fingerprints. Every animal has its own blood group.
Wow.
And if you're pretty smart, you can match blood groups of calves and dams, and you can therefore match them back to a bull. So I was doing multiple sire mating in an open range situation, trying to track what bulls were doing. So we would then muster those cows and calves, mother the cows up so we could match the calf to the dam, and then using blood groups of calf, dam and bulls, we could match bulls back to calves. So we knew what bulls were getting how many calves.
Yep. And what sort of calves they were producing, and as in
not so much
quality?
What sort of calf. No, it was just how many. This was just about survival and numbers.
Yeah.
And so I found straight away that I was using 5% bulls, and 3 out of every 5 bulls in every group that I trialled were getting me over 90% of the calves.
Yeah, right.
So I just took 2% of the bulls.
Yeah.
And then I was trying to work out, how do you pick the 3%?
That's right.
I only got sort of halfway down that track and never worked it out properly. That was one. The other one was the wet season protein deficiency in Northern Australia. We discovered that, proved it operated and worked, and then proved how to fix it. The other one, there was another one on ecology. I think probably the only person in the world that I'm aware of anyway that's related individual plant species positively and negatively to animal performance.
So the nutrition or the quality of the plant, the animal eating it, it's either going to be a positive or negative.
Correct.
Outcome from that.
And I did that in a 13,000 hectare experiment, We had,
Truth.
that was my big breeder experiment where I was doing nutrition research. I also just monitored the plants, not knowing what I was going to find, but every year we'd do a fairly detailed botanical survey.
But how could you actually work out to that particular species? Like, go, you're a good one or a bad one for these animals?
So what happened? Well, I had variable animal production across these paddocks.
Yeah.
There was 12 or 13 paddocks, and then we had variable species across these paddocks. Like across 13,000 hectares, that's a fair bit of variability across the country. And then with a lot of computer power and sort of some statistical approaches, an approach called pattern analysis, we were able to find patterns in the data where particular plants were positive, and there was only 4 grasses that were positively correlated to animal performance.
Yeah.
And there was about 20 odd that were negatively correlated to animal performance. So,
Great.
but then what we found was that those 4 grasses were disappearing.
Because they were being selected.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the animals knew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and this is where my journey in Regen Ag started. This was the first bit of gut feel that I had about Regen Ag, that there was a problem with what we were doing. And so I recognised that these desirable perennials were disappearing. And I brought ecologists out. We drive around the paddocks. I show them the data. I say, look, these grasses are declining, and I didn't have the data at that stage to say they were also the ones that were producing the animal production, but you could see they were in decline. Anyway, and the answer I'd get back from everybody that I asked was, that's just normal. That's just what happens. But my gut was saying, that's wrong. You know, why should the most desirable species in your plant community disappear? And this was happening at a beast of 35 acres. Wasn't heavily stocked.
It wasn't, no, well, right? Yeah.
So it was being selected. Anyway,
and that would have been happening across rangelands up there in millions of
every piece of pasture in the world. It's happening.
Yeah.
Not just rangelands in Northern Australia.
Yeah.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
So animals select the ice cream plants.
Yeah.
Now I had no idea at that stage what was causing that, but again I had this gut feel that, and I felt that I was doing wrong. You know, I was doing wrong by this country, this landscape, to have that happen. But I had no idea. Nobody could tell me what was wrong. So that was about 84, 85, 86. I had that sort of sense, and it just got worse. And then I published all of that stuff in 85, 86. And then Cliff Emerson, the guy who was my original boss there, he'd left the station halfway through the R&D program, and he'd set up the Northern Territory Cattlemen's Association. Anyway, he'd gone back to the States in about 83, and he'd come across Parsons and Savory. And he came back to me with this pile of literature from Parsons and Savory, and he said, have a read of this stuff. So I said, yeah, I'll take it and read it. So I read it, and I saw him a few months later, and he said, well, what'd you think of that stuff? And I said, Cliff, I've never read so much bullshit in all my life. I said, how in the heck could you afford to cut your country up into little paddocks and then muster them all the time?
Yeah.
Right? It was just beyond my ability to conceive. And bear in mind, at this stage, I'm sitting on an 850,000 acre property with very few fences.
That would seem like, how could you bloody...
Yeah. Right? So,
which is probably still a paradigm.
Absolutely, and I understand that paradigm.
Yeah, well, you were in it. Yeah.
And also, I'd come from the conventional wisdom that just set stocking, that's the way to do things.
Yeah.
So so Cliff went back again in about would have been 88, and he met Stan Parsons, and he came back again with stuff, and he talked to me about Stan. And he
so
said,
Stan was based in the States then?
Yeah. Stan was in Albuquerque with Alan. Alan was in Albuquerque as well. But they weren't together at that stage. They split up in 83.
Yeah, they were, just for the listeners, they started their partnership in South Africa or Africa.
They actually started it in Zimbabwe.
Yes. Yeah.
In the would have been late 60s,
wow.
early 70s, and then Then they moved to South Africa. They worked in South Africa, Namibia. And then in the late 70s, they moved across to the US and thought, there's the honeypot, we'll go there.
Yes.
And they basically consulted. They weren't doing much teaching then. And then they started doing some teaching. And then in 83, they had a split. And then Stan established the Ranching for Profit School, and Alan established Holistic Management.
And they were both in the States with their separate streams at the same time?
Yeah, both living in the same town, both living only a few hundred metres apart, the same part of Albuquerque.
Wow.
Anyway, Cliff said he'd met Stan and he gave me this literature again, and I read it and I came back to him with the same answer. I said, Cliff, this is just rubbish.
Yeah, you can't do it.
Can't do it. Anyway, Cliff was smarter than me, and Stan and Hazel were coming out to Australia on holidays in '89, and Cliff said to Stan, if I pay your fare to come from Brisbane to the Northern Territory, I want you to be our guest speaker at the AGM of the Northern Territory Cattlemen's Association.
Oh, yep.
So Stan did.
Line that right up, yep.
And then Cliff got him out on a couple of stations. Anyway, then Stan, he was in Alice Springs for a bit, and then he came back up through Darwin, and Cliff said, right, you two people are going to meet. So he basically put us into a room in the office of the Northern Territory Cattlemen's Association, introduced us.
You can have it out.
Shut the door and walked out. Well, walked out and shut the door.
Yeah.
So Stan and I had a good yarn for a good half a day or more, and he was fascinating, and he started talking about this rubbish, like stuff he'd seen in Alice Springs. He was really excited. He'd seen this animal impact and how the animal impact was, and I'm thinking, whoa, hang on here, what's this rubbish? Anyway, after that visit, a bloke called Peter Plummer, who was the secretary of the Northern Territory Department, which is the job, he got the job that I'd originally applied for.
He was the second best.
But he was an ex-school teacher. Yeah. And so he had no paradigms, and he came, and by Cliff, because Cliff had organised this again, and he came to me and said, look, I want the industry and our staff exposed more to Stan Parsons.
Yeah, cool.
But he said, I want you to organise it. And I said, well, I can't. I'm not going to pay for that.
You weren't really on board.
No.
With his thing, yeah.
He said, I'll tell you what I'll do then. He said, you give me a budget and I will underwrite it.
Wow.
And so I gave him a budget of flying Stan out here. And then so we were going to do 4 one-day workshops. One in Rockhampton, one in Charters Towers, one in Alice Springs, and one in Katherine. Anyway, Stan arrived in Australia and the pilot strike hit.
So is this
89?
89? Late
89, and the pilot strike was on.
Yeah, right.
So I had to jump in an aircraft in Darwin and fly to Rocky.
Good thing you had your
pick him
ticket.
Up. Yeah. So I flew down in this little Cessna 210 and arrived in Rocky, and we had this one day, and there's a bloke called Larry Acton who I knew down here, and Larry was part of one of the ag groups. He ended up as heading up Ag Force. And anyway, so Larry used his influence, and he got about 20 people in the room in Rocky to listen to Stan. And then we flew out to Larry's place after that and had a look at Larry's place. And at the end of that first day, Cliff rang me up and said, well, what was he like, was this worth it? Have we done the right thing? And I said, a lot of what he has to say is absolutely brilliant. I said, that guy is really brilliant. But I said, if only we could shut him up about this stupid cell grazing stuff. And I said, he's just talking about it too much,
Yeah,
and
right.
Anyway, then we had problems with the plane leaving Rocky, and problems with the plane every leg of the way. Anyway, got to Charters Towers, had more problems with the plane, got them fixed. Then we did a one-day workshop there, and then flew to Alice Springs from there. And then we did another one in Alice Springs. And same thing, he just kept talking about this cell grazing stuff, and it was a real concern to me. And we arrived in Katherine, had more trouble with the plane, and then we were about to fly back to Darwin, and I said to Stan, there's people going back to Darwin by car, do you want to drive back or come back by plane? He said, I'll go back by car. Turned out to be a good decision. I landed the plane on the main runway in Darwin and blew a tyre. I said, that was the end of it. Like things had gone wrong with that plane all the way.
Yeah.
So I'm stuck on the main runway. There's jets flying around there wanting to land. The fireys come out, picked up the plane, dragged it off the runway, gave me a lift back. It was owned by one of the local air traffic controllers, and I just rang him up and said, your plane's off the runway, blown tyre, you just go and fix it up, get it. I'm sick of it. Right? So
I'm done.
But I'm done, yeah. Anyway, we got around it. And that was the beginning. So that was late '89. So he came out first in April '89, and then he came back in October '89. And then Pam and I were about to leave the territory at that stage, so we decided we wanted to come to Rocky. And so we put on a ranching for profit school in Rockhampton in March 1990.
So Stan was facilitating. He was there.
He taught it.
He taught it. Was it a week?
It was a week.
So the kind of the format that the grazing for profit and grazing and farming for profit.
Yep.
Reasonably similar.
Yeah. And 21 or 22 people turned up for that.
Yeah.
And that said, gee, there's a bit of interest, and that was just out of those first few workshops. And
where were you with your still grazing mumbo
I
jumbo
was
by then?
still concerned. You know, because remember I come out of the DPI paradigms, and then we put on a second school that year, 1990, and 32 people turned up.
In Rocky?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought, geez.
Do you remember some of the ones that were there? Like,
yeah.
Are they still clients?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Some of the, I tell you what, at Beef Week this year,
Yeah.
there was 21 people at that first course, and there was 5 of us in the seminar at Beef Week in 2022.
Yeah, wow. That's
In the
great,
same
isn't it?
room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Little posse.
Yeah, so people still turning up. Raymond Stacey, who works for RCS today, was in that first seminar, did the first grazing for profit school,
Really?
and then now consults for RCS.
You were saying, and I can't remember when you told me this, I can't remember if it was on an interview or we were just having a chat, that you, last year sometime, you were doing grazing for profit, and you saw the grandchild?
10th grandchild.
10th grandchild of one of your like clients that had done the course, graduates, and that for you was like, that's signing off.
Yeah, I'd had this little thing in the back of my mind that when I got to teach the 10th grandchild, in other words, I taught the grandparents, the parents, and now the grandchildren, and we've been getting heaps of second generation through the schools for quite a number of years, and that's been a massive privilege. And then I'd had this little thing in the back of my head, when I get to the 10th grandchild, I'll pull up. And I was at the last smoko, in the last afternoon of the school, and I realised that the 10th one was in the room, and I confirmed it at smoko.
What'd you say, did your granddad or grandmother?
Yeah,
There you go.
because I knew that one set of his grandparents hadn't done the school, but I'd forgotten about the other set of grandparents, and it suddenly dawned on me. He said, yeah, I'm staying with them in town. And he said, they said to say good day to you. And anyway, I said, oh, right, okay.
So what did that mean
So
to you then?
I finished that school off at 5:30 or 5:45 that afternoon, and I announced at the end of that school that this was my last one.
Had you told anyone
nobody,
work?
Nobody knew. I didn't know.
Yeah,
right, so I didn't do it.
No,
That's
it
my
wasn't
last school, which is a good way to do it. Like
yeah, but the time was right.
Yeah, the time was right.
Tell me, I'm really interested, Terry. You met, and I guess you were kind of forced into it by the sounds of it, to kind of buddy up with Stan Parsons. Where was Alan Savoury in the mix? Were you not reading his information? You just didn't get to meet him? Like, why did you end up doing the Stan stream, not the Alan stream?
It was coincidental. It was the stream. Stan was the guy that Cliff met. Stan was the guy that came out to Australia first. Stan came back again. Stan was prepared to work with us. I knew a bit about Alan at that stage, very little. and Stan told me quite a lot about Alan, which is all good. Stan was always very complimentary of Alan and always acknowledged Alan at every school Stan ever did. It wasn't until what happened in that first year, towards the end of that first year, there was a senior guy in DPI who used to be a boss of mine, caught up with me and he said, look, I hear you're bringing Parsons and Savoury to Australia. And I said, well, I'm bringing Parsons out. And he said, we've got a pile of literature 3 inches deep of all the land that they've destroyed all over the world, wherever they've been. And we said,
who was this? This was a
senior officer in Queensland DPI.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And he said, we're going to run them out of Australia because we don't want them doing the damage they've done everywhere else.
Wow.
And he said, if you stay mixed up with them, you're going to go down with them.
Wow.
And they tried. They tried very, very hard for 10 years to put me out of business. And very nearly succeeded in the early days.
So that would have been in the 90s, was it?
This was 1990.
Yeah, yeah.
Right as we were starting. And
yeah, that's a bit sinister, isn't it?
yeah, and they tried, and they were publishing stuff where they were actually calling us snake oil salesmen. This is completely wrong. You should not go and do one of these courses. Anyway, I was flat broke at the time, and so I had no resources. And one of our clients said, "Look, I got a cousin in Rocky. He's a solicitor. I'll pay his fee if you go along and see him. Tell him what's going on." So I did. I went and saw Andrew, and he said, "Oh yeah," he said, "I'll just write you a letter," and he did. So he wrote me this letter, and I walked into a senior DPI guy's office one afternoon. I put the letter on the table, and I said, if I ever, and I put some of this literature on the table, I said, if I ever see anything like this in print again, you guys are going to court. And it pulled them up putting stuff in print. Didn't stop them white-handing us.
So it was like a cease and desist letter in a way.
It was, yeah. And they stopped. And they actually had a fear for a very long time that if they overstepped the line anywhere, we were going to be in trouble.
Hello. Yeah, right.
And
good. So was that? Do you think they kind of were they generally concerned and went, "Oh, we've read this stuff and it's going to ruin it," or did they see you? Did they kind of see that as a threat? Not so much that it was literally an on-ground ecological threat, but it was more you and bringing this information in was going to give 180 degrees to the paradigm and the DPI's whatever charter they were on. Like, you know, was it a genuine concern, or was it more like these people are going to make us look bad?
I think it was both. I think initially it was a genuine concern, but they wouldn't even talk. We sat down and tried to talk to people who were very critical and try and just explain what we were doing and what we were saying. And it was emotional, like it was unbelievable. They would just go red and scream, and
it was an affront.
It was an affront, an absolute affront. So that said to me that it was actually more than just challenging the science, it was actually challenging careers. Yeah. And so if I was right, most of the careers in grassland and rangeland science in Australia were wrong.
Well, I mean, there are. I'm not naming names, but there are senior. I don't even know what you'd call them. I mean, I guess they're agronomists. I'm going to call them, and generally pasture agronomists that are still on that page. They're still affronted.
They're still out there. Yeah, and I understand it. Like, it's about paradigms. If you've got your career and your life invested in your papers and your science and your PhD and whatever else it is, then and you switch that 180 degrees, you're actually admitting that a lot of that actually wasn't right. But to me, that's not science. Like that was a science at the time, and that was testing a particular theory, right? Now there's a different theory. Let's test that. But no, it's like, just put the barriers up. There's no way that can be right.
Because it wasn't as though that old stuff was necessarily wrong. It was, as you say, it was just built on a different set of principles and objectives.
Different paradigms. Yeah. And it was obviously right within the paradigms it was done, but not right in terms of new paradigms. Yeah. But what was happening, which was really fascinating, was the industry was picking it up. the industry got it just like that.
Yeah.
You know, as you know, when you hear the common sense in some of this stuff, it just makes sense.
Pretty compelling.
It's compelling. And so you think, oh yeah, that's right, you know.
Yeah.
But
It does smack you,
scientists
though.
couldn't get it.
No. But as a cocky going to grazing for profit in 2005, whatever it was, like it was confronting, definitely. And I know there was people at our course, and you know them, and I have to laugh without naming names, but they were affronted and really challenged. But the wonderful thing was that whilst you were being challenged, you were given an alternative to go to. It wasn't as like, that's all wrong and I'm going to leave you high and dry. That was like, that's not even wrong. That is what we are basing, you know, farmers are basing a lot of stuff on for many years, but here's a very compelling alternative, which is the beauty of it.
It's not even that we were actually saying what's happening now is wrong.
No.
We were just saying, here's a way.
There's a
way.
Yeah.
It was actually the scientific community to a large degree that made it wrong, that started talking about rights and wrongs. And but we never tried to say that's right and that's wrong. We're just saying here's a way that makes sense to us.
But what was evident and interesting, and a really good way to put it was, without saying it was wrong, there was a lot of things I remember that came up and I went, oh my God, why do I do that? Like, why do we keep all our cows in their separate age groups and different packages?
Yes.
That was like, that's a classic, you know. It's like, oh, because Dad did, you know.
Yeah.
So it wasn't as though there was, it was wrong. It was more like, it was almost like, why are you so stupid that you do that? You know, not quite that bad, but so let's jump to, because I'm conscious of the time. We're not even out of the 90s yet. So RCS was born.
Well, it was born in '85 in Darwin, and Cliff again was instrumental in this. And he said, "You got to go and meet David Hanlon." And so Cliff organised for David and I to meet. David was an economist, and I was basically focused on production. And we thought, well, that'd be a nice combination.
Son.
Yeah, you're going to.
No, because I'm just tracking it. I reckon if, as it swings down, I'm hoping it's just going to come on the edge of that bit of greenery there. No, I'm fine.
So I met David, and then I thought, well, David seems to know what he's talking about, so we'll just join forces and we'll become Resource Consulting Services.
Yeah.
That was March '85, and then that contract I got to write up all the material from Mount Bundy was RCS's first contract. I spent that year.
So that was
then.
official.
Yeah.
You're official then. So a lot happened in the next 10 years, I imagine. So you picked up. Do you become an agent for that, for the grazing for profit? How does that work?
No, well, we basically starved for about, probably 10 years or more, really, from '85 through to the mid '90s to late '90s, and then. So while we were in Darwin, we were mostly working on Aboriginal properties, doing business plans for Indigenous properties, and a little bit of work for some of the corporates on nutrition and things like that. But then I was getting more work back in Queensland. So Pam and I decided that we were going to leave the territory by the end of '89, and so we did, and we headed to Rocky, being basically the centre of the northern beef industry. And we couldn't find any accommodation there, so her sister found us accommodation in Yeppoon, so quite by default we ended up in Yeppoon, and we're still there.
Is that right?
And so that was the end of '89. We arrived in Yeppoon, and we ran our first school in Yeppoon in March 1990. That was really the beginning of the RCS journey as it is. And I guess one of the things that, if I can go back to that mid '80s, the thing that gut feel that I had about losing those desirable perennials, what Stan did for me eventually was make me realise that losing those perennials was actually down to lack of rest. And that was when I put those two things together, then I knew Stan was on the right track. I was very fortunate though that when the DPI threatened me, I had to do something. I had to work out really, and I still didn't know in 1990 whether Stan was right or whether the DPI was right. So I applied for a Churchill Fellowship and got that and went away in 1991, and that was really the turning point, because I was then able to study, and I went everywhere where Alan Savory and Stan Parsons had ever been. I went to both of their clients. I went right back to their roots in Zimbabwe. I went right back to their roots in South Africa and Namibia. And I got to the bottom of some of the myths. And that was really important.
Yeah.
And I started out trying to fault the principles. And I found lots of times where the principles, you could fault, I could find faults in management, but I could not fault the principles. And so I realised pretty quickly then, on very early on that Churchill Fellowship, who was right and who was wrong. And I had to work out how was I going to handle the opposition. Because the opposition was not only Queensland DPI, but CSIRO, every state department of agriculture in Australia, was all up at arms against what we were talking about, this cell grazing rubbish. And so what I decided, and I can still remember this too, sitting in a motel room in Harare, waiting for the plane to come back to Perth and then Darwin, I decided there and then that in the future I would only talk to people who wanted to listen, and I would never again try to convince people that weren't prepared to listen or weren't prepared to give us a hearing. And I'm not there to convince people who don't want to be convinced. I'm there to talk about what I know. And that was the breakthrough in me being able to handle that opposition. And to this day, I stick to that.